Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be painting a seascape with sailboats, and I'm going to show you the key points you need to get right when painting these boats so that they look real without you having to put in too much detail. I'm also going to discuss how you position these boats so that you can enhance the composition of the painting. So let's get started. This is our reference. It's a lovely photo capturing that early morning light of a sunrise and with some boats in fairly calm water. The only changes I'll make to this reference is I'll move the sun from the edge into a more central position, and I'm going to adjust the positioning of some of these boats. At the moment, these two boats are dividing this space into three almost equal parts, and by moving them around or adding an additional boat, we can make this composition more interesting. As we're concentrating on boats, I'm going to have less sky in this painting and more water. So I'll start, if this is about the middle of the paper, I'll come up about 1/2 inch and we'll draw our distant horizon line. And I'll make it a bit more defined just so you can see it better. And that's good enough. I'm going to start by placing a key boat at around about this position here, which is a little bit to the left of center. So if this is the center, I'm going to draw in my main boat here. Usually when I'm drawing these sailboats, I start by positioning the mast. And this is going to be close to us, so I'm going to bring the mast down below the horizon. Give it a little cabin. One of the key things to get right, normally the mast is not in the center of the boat, it's a little bit towards the front, so put that in. And generally you've got a pointy end and a not so pointy end at the back. And the boom, which is at the bottom of the sail, when you're placing it, think in terms of if someone is standing in the back of the boat, if they're not careful, it can clock their head. So that's how I position the boom. We'll add some portholes. So these are the key shapes you want to get right in your boat. Now you can enhance that because this boat is a reasonable size, so we can put a line into the water and the anchor is connected to that. Quite often you'll have railings around the boat. I normally don't draw them in with a pencil, I just draw them in later with my brush. One other thing to take into account is how high you want to make the mast. So just as a general guideline, what I say to my students is, as long as it's about 1.5 boat lengths high, it will look fine. I've seen boats that are way taller than that, but what you don't want is a mast that's very short, so it only comes to about there. It just doesn't look right. So you just measure that distance from the tip of the boat to the back, and then roughly 1.5 lengths or a bit more of that from the water to the top of the mast. So that's our main boat. We're now going to place another one over here. This boat's going to be further away, sometimes the back of the boat is curved in this direction. And because it's a small shape, I didn't bother putting in the mast first. And now the boom, relative to the boat, is still in the same position, but what you're going to see has happened is, whereas here the boom is below the horizon line, this one's far enough back that the boom's actually above the horizon line. The reason for this is that as the boats move further away from you, where they sit in the water will appear to be getting closer and closer to the horizon line. Okay, so this is what we call linear perspective. So the fact that the distance from the horizon line to the bottom of this boat, or where it hits to the waterline of this boat, is smaller than here, that's another indicator that this boat is further away. Then we'll put another boat here. The reflections are also important. The key thing with reflections is that the reflection is directly below the object being reflected. For instance, this is the mast, so it's going to be about there. For this one, about there, and this one about here. The reflection of the hull comes first. The reflection of the mast doesn't start at the waterline, it starts lower down, because first you've got to reflect the hull. Sometimes you can see a hint of the cabin and certainly the boom. I draw them in with a bit of a squiggle. Don't draw them as dead straight lines, otherwise you make the water look like it's a pure mirror surface. You don't see the reflection as well for boats in the distance, but I'm going to put them in anyway. Remember, we're just creating a work of art here. And I'm going to put another small boat here. So I've just created a grouping of different size boats positioned in different parts of the picture plane. And to add a little bit more interest, we're going to have a little rowboat here. With a figure This figure is going to be in silhouette, so I don't need to get into too many details. And it will have a reflection. That's it for our drawing. Let's get on to the painting section. Let's begin by wetting the back of the paper. This is particularly beneficial when painting like this, where there's some big shapes that are mostly wet on wet. And I have the towel here to stop the water flowing underneath onto the front of the paper. The front of the paper is not wet. I keep that dry. All right, while that's sitting there, let's mix some paint. If we look at our sky, we've got this lovely deep blue going into a very pale sort of beige. And remember, I'm moving the sun over to here, and then with hints of reds in the distance, reds and orange. My process when mixing colours is to determine how much of each I need to mix, and then I put that amount of water into the palette, or a little bit more. I like to err on the side of mixing too much paint rather than not enough. So we've got blue for the sky, we've got some of the orange, and then we've got the yellow. And this orange will have some red in it as well. And I'm mixing more of the sky colour than I need, because I'll be using that when I come to painting the water. In fact, the same applies to these other colours. Just clean the top of this cobalt blue. Normally I don't worry about cleaning the top of the paint, but for the sky I do like a nice clean looking colour, especially for the blue. Too bright, so I'm going to add some French ultramarine to it. Good, that'll do for the blue. And some very weak cad yellow. Weak cad orange. And we'll clean that. Great. And to make it easy for myself, I'm going to mix another puddle of the orange, a little bit of permanent rose in it. And I can use that just to create more interesting transitions. Okay. Let's wet the back of this again. All that water I had put in the back of the paper has been absorbed. Even though this is 185 GSM paper or 90-pound weight paper, it's amazing how much water it will absorb. And I'll wet my board. The paper is dead flat, sticking to the board, and I can feel that it's cool to touch, which tells me there's plenty of water below the surface, but the top of the paper is bone dry. All right, now this area is going to be, where the sun is, and there's going to be a fairly pale portion of the sky. So if I start painting the sky with my paper in this position, the problem is all that deeper blue from up above is going to run into it, and I'll lose this bright light. So In this painting, we'll turn our board around like this, and we're going to paint our sky this way. So I'll start with cad yellow, and I'm going to just create a big half a halo at that position. And then as I move away from that, I'll move it to other colours. Decided there's a bit of pink here, so I'll put some of that in. And then some of the orange. And then we'll go into the blue. Run some of that on this side. Now I'll pick up just some even weaker cad yellow. There we go. Now, just to make the sky a little bit more interesting, I'm going to put in a few clouds. Pick up some of this blue, find a dry part of my palette, say here, add some permanent rose to it, a bit more French ultramarine. Tiny bit of the cad orange. Grab some more permanent rose. Quite often early in the morning and late in the evening, the bottom of the clouds will have a little bit of pink on them. And you can see how I turned my board around this way so that these clouds would stay roughly in a line this way rather than flowing down the paper. My board sits at about 20 degrees because I can use gravity then to help me create these nice clean washes. And that's what our sky is going to look like. I'm happy with the sky. I really don't want these clouds to slide down any further, so I'm going to dry it and then we can work on the water. So now we're going to paint the water. The water is going to reflect what's in the sky, so I have to make sure that I reflect what's in my sky, not what's in the reference photo. Reflections are duller than the colours being reflected, and reflections of light objects are generally darker, with the reverse also being true, reflections of dark objects being lighter. So keeping that in mind, I have all these colours that I've used for the sky already in my palette, and I'll use them as the starting mixes for my water. Let's clean some of this out, however. There's very little yellow showing through. I'll just put a bit of yellow there. Remember, the reflections are going to be duller, so I had a little bit of this dirty colour left on my brush, so let's just automatically dull that. The orange, we can dull that with some of this blue-grey mix I had there. And we'll add a bit of blue into this. So immediately we've dulled our colours. The colour of the water, as it gets closer to us in this reference, becomes quite strong. So I'm going to add more French ultramarine, a little bit of permanent rose, and some burnt sienna, which will just dull it a bit so it's not a vibrant blue. And that's pretty good. That'll do. So we don't want that, we want this colour here. Add a little bit of that here. A bit more orange. Doesn't matter if you exaggerate some of these colours. Okay. Then we'll go into the blue. You have to be careful with permanent rose. A little bit goes a very long way. Just hinting at these clouds. And then we have ripples in the foreground. clear some of this out of the way again. Start with some of this blue, and we'll add more paint, but no more water. We'll just start by darkening this area, and then we're going to put in some ripples. Bigger ones in the foreground, getting smaller into the distance. Change this shape a little bit. And what I've done there is I picked up some of that paint and added more paint in a dry part of the palette, and that gives me some even thicker paint, and go in and modify the foreground ripples with that. Keep the size varied. And it's important to leave little light areas, because that's what's going to help contribute to the impression of undulations. Alright, so now we've done the water and the sky. Let me go and dry that. So we've got an island or landmass in the distance, so I'm going to paint that in. It's a long way away. It's very dark. I'm just going to use some of this sea colour and dull it with a bit of orange. So orange is the complementary colour of blue, so the two will dull each other out. You don't want to make that too strong in tone, because the strongest tones are going to be in these boats in the foreground. Okay, now before I start working the boats I have to dry that again, otherwise if I try to paint the mast in, the mast would bleed into this background colour. Doesn't need a lot of drying. Look at these boats, there's not a lot of detail, they're fairly dark, so we can use some of our darker colours in my palette to create the colours we'll need for these boats. So these are our two darkest mixes. going to start with my lighter mix, and we'll use that for some of these boats in the distance. Similar objects that are in the distance will always be lighter than the same objects in the foreground. We'll put the reflections in. And normally the reflections of the masts would be in a very still scene. The height of the mast is about how long the reflection would be, but because you have ripples in there, the ripples can make that reflection go even further. Now, where the boat hits the water, it's usually quite a bit darker than the sides of the boat. So for that, I just get some French ultramarine and burnt sienna. Create a thicker mix. That might have been a bit too much, so I'll just lift some of that. That's better. That boat's done for now. And I've used similar mixes for these three boats that are furthest away. I'm going to lift some of this paint. The hull, if it's white, obviously will be a little bit lighter than the reflection around it. Then I'll pick up some more of this thicker paint. I'm just going to very quickly hit these two boats with the hairdryer, because if I try to paint this boat or this boat, I risk smudging that paint. Before I do that, however, let's put the boom in for this boat. Okay. Now, if you're not comfortable drawing a straight line like that with the brush, by all means, use a ruler. Let me show you. So if you want to draw a straight line, say the mast, you can get a ruler like this, rest the ferrule's a silvery bit, on the ruler, hold the ruler at an angle away from the paper, and then just draw a line like that, okay? And then you can continue with your painting. And I've left a little gap there just to hint at some light being reflected off part of the hull. Put ripples in, especially for these bigger boats closer to the foreground. You can't put this line in too soon or the paint will just flow down and not define that edge. It doesn't matter that much because you can just put it back in. These are very small shapes, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, I'm now going to lift some of the paint off the hull of this boat. A little bit off the cabin. And I'm going to pick up some French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I only need a tiny amount and it's almost going to be pure paint. Very thick. Just going to dab that in and indicate the portholes in the cabin area. Sometimes along the edge of these boats, I'll quite often have some decorations, so I'll get similar paint, put that in. Now, the bigger the boat, the more detail you have to put in. booms would be tied down somewhere. And quite often there'll be things at the top of the mast. Something like that. All right, let's work on this boat. So most of these boats I've just painted with the size 8 brush. That stops me from trying to put in too much detail. Paper is starting to dry now because this area here is just cockling marginally, but because I'm close to the end of the painting I can handle that. And remember, the reflections are directly below the object being reflected. You can't have a mask there and its reflection over here. It's easy to get that wrong. You know, it's not the end of the world. Usually you just put in another boat and then put in an extra mask reflection. Okay, we'll lighten that. I'm just using a combination of burnt sienna and French ultramarine for this mix. Using a very light touch to redefine some of those edges. And again, very thick mix of French ultramarine and burnt sienna. The little boat will have a reflection and the figure will have a bit of a reflection. I'm happy with that. I've kept the boats quite simple. They're small boats. Their key function in this painting is to help break up shapes and spaces into more interesting shapes and spaces. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so and hit the notification bell so that you'll be advised of each new video I produce. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.